So it's day 4 of our Laravel Vue SPA tutorial, and in today's video, we're going to be building our forms for creating lists and tasks, as well as updating our dashboard to implement all the functionality from our Pina stores that we created in the last video. So let's jump into it. So the first thing we want to do is create our form components for creating a task and creating a list. So let's create a few new folders in the components area. Create one for list, and we'll create one for tasks. And now we want to create a create task form component. And we also want to create list form component. And we're making these as components because we might want to use these forms in multiple places throughout our app. So we're going to make reusable components. So we'll start with the list form. And now let's import a few things. We also want to import our list store. We'll initialize our list store. And because we may want to show when an action has taken place back on the dashboard, we're going to use the emit functionality to send back events to other components. And we'll do that like this. We'll define emit equals define emits, and we'll pass in an array of events. We'll have one for list created. We'll have one to close the form. Now let's set up our form data. And our forms just accept as name. And then we'll build a function to reset the form. And a function to close the form. And we're using emit here because whether or not the form is going to be shown is actually going to be handled in our dashboard. So we're going to pass back an event that tells the dashboard to hide the form. And the last function we want to build is our handle submit form function. And now if you remember, in our list store, when we add a list, we're either returning true if it succeeds or we're returning false if it fails. So what we're going to say is a variable called success equals await list store, add list, and we'll pass in the form data. And then we'll say if success, we'll reset the form. So we'll clear out the fields, make sure the form is ready to create a new list, and we'll emit an event, list created. If it fails, we'll just log the errors. And there we go. That's most of our functionality. Now let's build out a little HTML. So create a form. We'll say on submit, prevent the default action, and trigger the handle submit form function. Now we just need one input, and it's a text input. And we're going to bind that to the list form name field. We'll apply some default styling and a placeholder. And now we'll just create a button for creating the list and a button to cancel if we want to close the form. And this will be our cancel button. So we'll call the handle close form function. And then we'll create our submit button. And we want to make sure that if someone's already in the process of creating a list, if the API request has already been sent and we're waiting, that we don't allow them to keep clicking the button. So we'll say disabled equals list store, and we'll check the loading add variable. And if loading add is true, the button will be disabled. We'll add some default styling. And now we're going to use some Vue syntax. If the loading add variable is true, we'll say creating list. Otherwise, we'll show create list. Now, before we test this out and make sure it looks right and works, let's create our task form component, and then we'll work on our dashboard. And the imports are going to be similar. And we're also going to be importing the list store in our task form. And that's because we're going to want to use the active list property, and we might want to show the active list name. So we're just going to import that store. Now we'll initialize those. We'll define some emits for this form as well. And we'll create our task form data. We'll create a reset form function. Create a close form function, which emits an event. And we'll create our submit function. And for task, we did the same thing. We return true if it succeeds and false if it fails. So we'll say success equals await, task store, add task. And now for add task, we take in the list ID and the task data. So the way we're going to get this list ID is we're going to use the active list in our list store. So back here, we need to pass in two parameters. It's going to be the list ID and the task data. So the list ID, we're going to use the list store, active list property, and the task form data. And now if that succeeds, we want to reset the form and emit our task created event. Otherwise, we'll log the task store errors. And there we go. That's most of the functionality. Now let's just build out a little bit of HTML. And we'll create the form and we'll trigger the handle submit form function. And now we're going to need two inputs. We need one text input, and we're going to bind that to our task form name field with some styling and a placeholder. All right. Now we also need a field to determine the initial state of a task, because sometimes you might want to be creating a task list that you've already completed a few things on. So we're going to give people the option to say whether a task is incomplete, complete, or in progress. So we're going to use a dropdown, and we'll bind that to our task form status field with some styling. And now we just want three options. One for incomplete, one for in progress, and one for complete. And now the values here, if you look, we have incomplete, in progress, and complete. And if you go back to our task controller and you look at our store method, that's exactly what we're expecting for the status. We either expect incomplete, in progress, or complete. So those are the three values. That way, if someone comes in here, manipulates the HTML, tries to pass in their own value, it'll fail the validation and it won't be stored in the database. And so now we'll just add the same button setup. And this will be our close form button. And now we just need our submit button. And we'll do the same thing for the disabled functionality. We'll check to see if loading add is true. If it is, we'll make sure the button's disabled and we'll add some styling. Now in here, we're going to do the same thing. And if it's loading, we're going to show one piece of text. And if it's not, we're going to show a default button text. So we'll take task, store, loading, add. And if that's true, we want to say adding task to list. And if it's false, we'll say add task to list. Awesome. Now we have our forms built, but we can't see any of this and none of this is visible to us. So let's modify our dashboard so we can start to see some of this functionality. So let's open up our dashboard view, and it's pretty bare bones. So let's add a whole bunch of stuff. First, we're going to do all of our imports, and that's going to be the functionality we need from Vue, as well as our forms and our stores. So I'm going to import ref, and we're going to import this onMounted function. And we're doing that because we're going to create a function using onMounted that whenever this component mounts, we're going to grab all the lists from the database and make sure we display them to the user. So when they first load their dashboard, they can see all their lists. And then we're also going to import the forms and the stores. All right, now we'll initialize a few of those. So now we're going to create a couple variables to handle showing and hiding the forms, and a couple variables to handle showing alerts that signify whether we just created a new task or we just created a new list. So we'll say show create list and show create task. And then we're also going to create show list created. And if that's true, we're going to show a little pop-up that says, hey, you created a list. And we'll do the same for task. And now we're going to create a few functions to modify these variables. All right, now we'll just create a couple functions for opening and closing the forms. And we'll do the same for our task form. All right, awesome. Now we're going to create a function to update the active list. And so essentially when a user clicks on one of the lists that's displayed, we want a function that's going to update the active list in our list store. So let's create that now. We'll say update active list. And this is going to be asynchronous because not only are we going to update the active list, but we're also going to tell the task store to get the tasks associated to the newly selected list so we can display them as well. So we'll pass in the list ID that we want to update, and we'll say list store set active list to the list ID. And now we want to await the task store. And now we're going to go into our task store and we have this get list tasks, which takes in a list ID. So we're going to pass that list ID to that function. We'll say get list tasks. We'll pass in the list ID. Now we're almost done with the functionality, but one more thing that we want to add is our on mounted. And this is going to be an asynchronous call because when the component mounts, we want to run an asynchronous method to get the lists for this user. So we'll say await list store, get lists. Bam. Now we have a whole bunch of ESLint errors because none of this is being used yet. So let's modify our actual HTML in our dashboard a little bit and show some of this functionality. Because right now, if we click view dashboard, we don't see a whole lot. So first, let's style this dashboard text a little bit. Okay. And now we're going to build a 2-column grid that's going to be responsive. And for large displays, it'll display the columns next to each other. So you'll see the lists on the left and the tasks on the right. And for mobile displays, it'll show them one over the other. We'll create a div and we'll make a grid. And by default, it's going to be a 1-column grid. But on medium displays and larger, we'll say 2 columns with a gap of 4. And then we'll have 2 divs in here. And now first, we'll create a div with some styling. And we'll use the view vif. And if the list store is loading, this will be where we show that we're loading my lists. And then we'll say v-else. So if it's not loading, then we want to show this block. And we'll add a little bit of styling. Okay. And we'll add a little paragraph tag that just says task lists. And now in here, we're going to display the total number of lists that the user has. So we can say list store lists length. Now, if you save, you can see we have a task lists and we see a 0 here. Now that's awesome because we didn't put 0 in by default, which tells us we're receiving a 0 either from the default list store state or we're getting data from our database. So now we have our title that says task lists and shows the amount that we have. Well, now we'll add a button. And on click, we'll open the list form. And there we go. Now we have our task lists with a button to add a new task list. Now, before we display that form and try it out, let's add a little section to display any lists that we create. And we'll say v-if, and we only want to display this section if we have lists in that array and if the store isn't currently trying to load new lists. So we'll say v-if, we'll say if the lists array has a length, which means if it's not 0, and the list store is not loading. Okay, now we'll add a little bit of styling. And in here, we're going to use the Vue v-for functionality to loop through any lists in this array and display them as individual divs with a paragraph inside that displays the name. So we'll say div. So we're going to say v-for. We'll say list in list store lists. And now anytime you use v-for, you also want to add a key. And that just helps Vue to maintain integrity with its reactive components and not get lost with what element belongs where. So we'll add a little bit of styling. And now we're just going to add the list name. So we're looping through list store lists, and for each item, we're storing it in this list variable, and we can access that within this loop, and we're going to display the list name. So we'll save that, and we don't see anything change here because our lists is empty. So now, back up at the top of this element, right inside this first unstyled div, we're going to add another element, and this is where we're going to actually show our create list form. So we'll say if show create list is true, and we'll add some styling. And inside here, we already imported our create list form. So we're just going to use that element inside of our Vue component. So we'll say create list form. And now if you remember, inside of our create list form, we're using the emit functionality to pass back events to our dashboard. So we need to do something to handle those events inside of our dashboard. So we have close list form and list created events. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the @ symbol and then say list created. And now we can assign a function. Anytime that the list created event is fired, it will trigger this function. So we'll say handle list created. We'll do the same thing for close list form. And we'll say close list form. All right, so we can save that. And now if you click on our new button, bam, we have a create to-do list form. And I noticed there's a little issue with the styling of the button, so let's go fix that. You can see right here, I forgot to add a dash. So we'll save that. There we go. So now we have a create list form, and the cancel button will hide it. So let's go ahead and give it a shot. We'll open up our console, clear out our errors, and let's say daily tasks, and we'll hit create. And look at that. Now in our task lists, we have a daily tasks item displaying, and our task list count has updated automatically. And we did not reload the page. So that was all done with Axios in the background using our single page application reaching out to our API. That's awesome. We also cleared out the form, so we can go ahead and we can create another. We'll say weekly tasks. We'll hit create, and bam, now we have 2 lists. So now one more thing that I want to do, because we built the functionality for it. If you remember in our list store, we have this set active list functionality that will set the active list property, the state, to whatever we pass in as this list ID. So let's utilize that a little bit. Down in our v-for div, where we're actually looping through all of these lists, let's add one more thing. We're going to say if you click one of the lists, we'll update the active list to the list ID. And if you remember, we created that update active list, and that will pass in the list ID, send it to our list store, and set the active list to that list ID. And it'll also reach out to our task store and say, check the database for any tasks associated to that list. So now we've got that functionality, we can save. And now if you click on one of these, you can see right here, we got requests to our API, which tells me that it's working. but we don't see anything here. So let's add a little bit of dynamic styling to make sure that we can actually see which list is selected. So in our paragraph tag, we're going to add a dynamic class, and we're going to start by just styling it to be a little bit smaller of text. And now we're going to say plus, and we're going to check to see if the list store active list is equal to the ID of the list that we're looping through in our v4. So as it prints out each of these, it'll check to see if the one that we're currently creating matches the active list in our list store. And if it does, we'll say font bold, text blue 500. Otherwise, we won't add any additional style. And then we'll save. And now if you look, you can see daily tasks is bold and blue. And if we click weekly task becomes bold and blue. So now you can tell which task list is selected. And every time we click that, we're getting an API request to our back end. And you can see if we click weekly tasks, we get an API request to list/2 ID. And if we click daily, we get an API request to list/1, which is the ID in the database. And you can see that this is working by opening up a MySQL window, saying select all from task lists. And there you go. You have the user ID of the user who was logged in assigned to this daily task list, and the same thing for the weekly tasks. We have the name, we have when they were created, the timestamps, and the individual IDs. Awesome. So now the last thing we want to do is build out some functionality for our tasks. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to add a little pop-up. We're going to say if the show task created variable is true, we want to add a little bit of styling to this pop-up. Okay. And then we're just going to add a paragraph tag that says task successfully created. And we added the justify between and the item center because we're also going to add a button that jumps to the other side. So we'll have the task successfully created on the left, and we'll have a little button on the right, and the button is just going to close the little pop-up. So we'll say on click, we want to hide task created. We're just going to say text large. We're just going to make that a little X button. And now next, we're going to add another dynamic block that's just going to hold the create task form component. And if you remember in our task form, we do the same thing with the emits. We emit a closed task form and a task created event. So let's make sure we handle those. We'll say when close task form, run the close task form function. And for task created, we want to run the handle task created function. There we go. And we'll only show this block if show create task is true. All right. Now we have a little block that will only show the task form if that show create task variable is true. So now similar to our task lists, we need an area to show our tasks and a button to add a new task. So let's create that. First, we're just going to make a div with a little bit of styling. And in here, we're going to add a dynamic block. And if there's no active list, we're just going to show a paragraph that just says, please select a to-do list to see related data. And now we see just a white block over here, and that's because we do have a daily tasks list selected. But if you refresh the page, you can see that we have that little piece of text that just says, please select a to-do list to see the related data. Now, if there is a list selected, we'll say v else. We'll add some style here. And now what we're going to do here is we're going to use the JavaScript find method to check our list store lists array and see if we can grab one that matches the active list if there is an active list. So we're saying here, if the list store active list is not set, we want to show this piece of text, but if it is set, we want to check that active list against our lists array and pull out the name of the one that's selected. So I'll show you what that looks like. We'll say class, font, bold. We'll add some Vue syntax here, and we'll say list store lists find. Now we want to check each list and compare the list ID to see if it is equal to the list store active list. And so what this function will do is return back the first element in this array that matches this criteria. And now that we have that element, we can just say dot name. Now we'll save. And now if you click one of these task lists, we can see that the name pops up down here. Perfect. And now if you remember, up here, when we update the active list, not only are we just setting the active list in our list store, we're also running the get list tasks function to grab any tasks in the database that are associated to that list ID. And we're putting them in our task store. And if you look in our task store, it stores it in our tasks array. So what that means is that down here, we can also add a little parentheses, and inside, we can display the task store tasks length. And now that's showing the active number of tasks within that list. Because every time we update the active list, we're grabbing the associated tasks to that list and storing it in our task store. So now right below that, we're using this flex justify between again, which is going to send one element to the left and one element to the right. And on the right, we want to add a button to open the task creation form. All right. Now, before we test that out, let's just create a little area to display any tasks that we have in a list. So we'll add first a dynamic block that'll only display if the task store is currently loading or trying to get the tasks associated to a list. And we'll just add some style, say loading tasks. And now if you save, anytime we click this, you're going to see that loading tasks quickly pop up right below. And that's just signifying that it's reaching out to the database and it's trying to pull any tasks associated to the new list and grab them from our API. Now we'll create one more div. We'll say if task store tasks length. So if there's items in that array and the task store is not loading, add a little bit of style. And we're going to loop through using v-for again. So we're going to add a key, and the key is just going to be the task ID. And so now we'll say v-for, we'll say task in task store tasks. And since we just checked to make sure there were items in this array, we know that there's at least one element in here. And so it's going to loop through and give us this task variable. And the key is going to be the ID of that task. Now let's just add some default styling. And so now in here, what I'd like to do is add a paragraph element, and we're going to show the task name, but we're going to check the status. And if the status of the task is complete, we're going to put a strike through the task to signify that it's done. Otherwise, we're just going to leave it alone and show it with default styling. So to do that, we'll say class, and we'll add text small first, and then we'll say task.status equal to complete. And if so, we're going to add the line through class. Otherwise, we leave it alone. And then we're going to add the task name. All right. Now, the other thing I want to do before we finish this up and test this out is I want to add a button to mark the task as complete that shows next to the task name. So we'll say button, and we'll say on click, mark task complete, and we'll pass in the task, and we'll give it some styling. Now, we didn't create this mark task complete function yet. So now that we have our button to do so, let's create this function. So we'll do that right up here, right above the on mounted. We'll say mark task complete. We'll pass in the task, and we'll say the task data is an object where the name is the task name, and the status is complete. Because if you remember, if we go into our task controller and we look at the update function, we're expecting the request to include a name and a status every time. So we got to pass in the name and we got to pass in the status. And it also takes a task ID. And if you look in our task store, down at update, we pass that task ID and the task data to this endpoint. So we need to call update task and pass in the task ID and the task data. So let's do that. We'll say success equals await task store update task, and we need the task ID, which is the task that we just passed in, the ID property, and then the task data object that we just created. We'll just console log that result and we'll save. Now there's one more cool thing I want to do before we put this all together and try it out. So as it is right now, no matter what the status of our task is, we're going to show this mark complete button. But what I'd like to do is if it's already completed, we show a little check mark, and otherwise we show the button to complete it. So for this, I'm going to go to flowbyte.com/icons, and there's all these free SVG icons that you can use. And I'm going to look for check. And we'll grab this check circle. We'll say copy, and that's just an SVG. So we can go here and we can paste it in. And we'll just move this over. And we'll leave this alone. We'll get rid of dark mode. And all we're going to do to this SVG is say v-if, and we're only going to display it if the status of the task is equal to complete. And then otherwise, if it's not complete, we'll show the button instead. So we'll save that. And now we still have one ESLint error, and that's because we didn't make a pop-up for when a list was created. So if you want to get rid of that error, you can just comment out this function, and we'll add that a little later. But for now, just comment that out so we don't have any errors, and we'll save that page. Now we'll go back to our app, and let's give this a shot. We'll say create task. And now there's one more cool thing we could do. This form is our task form, and we can see which list is selected, but let's pretend we were on a phone and this was a little smaller and we were scrolling down and we had a whole bunch of lists. We might not be able to see which task list was selected, or maybe we're on a separate page and we can't even see this list. So in that case, let's modify this piece of text to use the same find function up here to grab the name from the list store. So let's just grab this whole piece of functionality and open up our create task form. And now up here, instead of saying add a task to list, we're going to say add a task, and then we're going to grab the name of the active list and we'll save. And now there you go. Now we're seeing add a task to daily tasks, or if we click weekly, add a task to weekly tasks. That's awesome. So now if we open this up a little bit, we can see how the grid is formatted. And if you zoom in, you can see that it changes based on your screen size. So now we can select daily tasks, and let's give this a shot. Over in our task form, we can say write some code, and we could choose a different status, but let's just leave this as incomplete, and we'll say add task to list. And look at that. A pop-up with tasks successfully created and a little X that we can click to get rid of the pop-up. And now in our daily tasks, we have write some code with a mark complete button. Now we could write another task and we'll say write some more code. And if you look here, we can see that this is now empty. That was an error in the create task form. So if you go to our create task form and you look up at our reset, we don't want to reset status to empty. We actually want to reset status to incomplete. So now when the form gets reset, it defaults to incomplete. So we'll add a new task, write some more code, and we'll add, and bam, another task added to the list. Now we can close out of that, and we have daily tasks selected, and that's our daily tasks. But now we can cancel this, and we'll select weekly tasks, and look at that, nothing, because those tasks are associated. If you look in our database, you can say select all from tasks, and we can see here that write some code is associated to list ID 1. And list ID 1 is the daily tasks. And we don't have anything assigned to task list ID number 2. So now we have daily tasks, which show our dailies, and we have weekly tasks, which show nothing because we haven't added any. So let's add a task in our weekly tasks. We'll say, write a whole bunch of code, and we'll add. And now we have a weekly task. We can cancel that. And now if we switch between daily and weekly, we can see the 2 different lists and the tasks inside. And now just for fun, let's say we wrote some code today. We can click our Mark Complete button and bam, write some code. The styling is perfect. The little check mark pops up. And if you look back in the database, you can see write some code has a status of complete. So our API is being referenced. Everything's working the way it should. That's awesome. So there we go. Forms are built, dashboard is updated, and we have basic read and write functionality for our to-do list app. In the next video, we're going to be adding the ability to create list invitations and share lists with other users. So be sure to stick around, and as always, happy coding.